They said I was worthless, damaged goods, a burden no reasonable person would want. At the Charleston slave auction on a sweltering morning in May of 1852, I stood on the auction block with the other defective slaves, the elderly, the sick, the crippled, the broken. I was 30 years old and I had been blind since the moment I drew my first breath. My eyes were open, but they saw nothing except an endless, impenetrable darkness that had been my entire world for 3 decades. The auctioneer barely bothered with me, his voice dripping with contempt as he gestured in my direction. Blind female, 30 years of age, can perform simple kitchen tasks under supervision. Completely docile. Do I hear $1? The crowd remained silent, prospective buyers looking away, unwilling to waste even $1 on someone they considered useless. 50 cents then? More silence, punctuated only by the buzzing of flies in the humid air. 25 cents. Someone take her off my hands before I have to pay to dispose of her. That's when Josiah Caldwell raised his hand with a dismissive wave, purchasing me for less than the cost of a decent meal. He thought he was acquiring a harmless, helpless creature who couldn't possibly threaten him or bear witness to his darkest secrets. He had absolutely no idea that in my world of perpetual darkness, I perceived everything with a clarity that would ultimately destroy him. My name is Esther, and this is the story of how a blind slave woman worth 25 cents brought down a wealthy murderer, and how the senses that society dismissed as inadequate became the most devastating weapons I would ever wield. I was born blind on a tobacco plantation in the Piedmont region of North Carolina in the year 1822, during a difficult winter that killed many of the weakest slaves. My mother, whose name was Ruth, told me years later that when I emerged from her womb after 18 hours of agonizing labor, the midwife immediately noticed something was wrong with my eyes. They were open but unfocused, staring at nothing, completely unresponsive to light or movement or the wave of a hand before my face. The midwife, an elderly enslaved woman named Mama Celia, who had delivered hundreds of babies over her 60 years, shook her head sadly and told my mother that I would never see, that I had been born with eyes that didn't work, that I was what white folks called defective. The plantation master, a man named Thomas Whitfield, was summoned to inspect me. He looked down at the tiny, blind infant in my mother's arms with undisguised disgust and irritation. "Blind," he said sharply. "What use is a blind slave? She'll never be able to work the fields, never be able to do anything productive. She's worthless." He turned to the overseer who stood beside him. "Drown it. We can't afford to feed useless mouths, and the mother can breed again." My mother, exhausted from labor but desperate to save her child, did something that could have gotten her killed. She spoke up, addressing the master directly without being spoken to first, a violation of plantation protocol that normally resulted in severe punishment. "Please, Master Whitfield," she begged, her voice hoarse and trembling. "Please don't kill my baby. I'll make sure she's not a burden. I'll teach her to work, to be useful. She won't cost you nothing extra, I swear it. Please, sir, please." Master Whitfield looked at my mother with cold calculation. She was one of his most productive field workers, strong and healthy, and he didn't want to damage her by killing her newborn in front of her. It might break her spirit, make her less useful. "Fine," he said after a long, tense moment. "You can keep it, but if she becomes a burden, if she costs me more than she's worth, I'll sell her south to the sugar plantations, and you'll never see her again. Do you understand?" My mother nodded frantically, clutching me tighter. "Yes, master. Thank you, master. I understand." And so I lived. Though I was always considered the least valuable person on the Whitfield plantation, the defective child who would never amount to anything. But my mother kept her promise. From the moment I could walk and understand instructions, she began teaching me how to navigate the world without sight, how to survive and even thrive despite my disability. And in doing so, she helped me discover something remarkable, something that would define my entire life and ultimately save it. My blindness had not left me helpless or diminished. Instead, it had forced my brain to develop in extraordinary ways, to compensate for the loss of one sense by dramatically enhancing all the others. My hearing became so acute, so refined, that I could perceive sounds most people never even noticed. I could hear a person's footsteps from 50 yards away and identify who it was by the rhythm of their gait, the weight of their step, the slight scuff of their particular shoes against the ground. I could hear conversations happening in the next room through closed doors, could distinguish between a dozen different voices speaking simultaneously, could detect the subtle changes in breathing patterns that indicated fear, anger, excitement, or deception. I could hear a person's heartbeat when I stood close to them, could tell if they were calm or anxious by the speed and rhythm of that internal drum. I could hear the rustle of fabric and know what type of cloth it was, cotton, wool, silk, linen, by the specific sound it made when it moved. I could hear rain coming hours before it arrived, could hear the approach of a storm in the changing patterns of wind and the behavior of birds and insects. My sense of smell became equally extraordinary, developing into something that seemed almost supernatural to those who witnessed it. I could identify every person on the plantation by their unique scent, a complex combination of their natural body odor, the soap they used if they used any, the food they ate, the work they did, the emotions they felt. Each person had a scent signature as distinctive as a face, and I never forgot a scent once I had encountered it. I could smell sickness before symptoms appeared, could detect the subtle chemical changes in a person's body that indicated fever, infection, or disease. I could smell fear in the sharp, sour tang of stress sweat. I could smell anger in the metallic edge that adrenaline gave to perspiration. I could smell lies. When people lied, their bodies produced slightly different chemicals, and I could detect that change. I could smell blood from remarkable distances, could distinguish between human blood and animal blood, could even tell if blood was fresh or old. I could smell poison. Many toxic substances have distinctive odors that most people never notice, but my nose caught them immediately. I could smell the bitter almond scent of arsenic, the acrid chemical smell of rat poison, the sweet, sickly odor of certain plant-based toxins, and I could smell emotions in ways that seemed impossible. Grief had a smell, joy had a smell, guilt had a smell, shame had a smell. People's bodies betrayed their inner states through chemical signals that my nose could read like a book. My sense of touch became my primary way of seeing the world, and it developed a sensitivity that amazed even my mother. I could run my fingertips over a person's face and read their features with perfect accuracy, creating a detailed mental image of what they looked like. But more than that, I could feel the tiny muscle movements beneath the skin, the micro-expressions that revealed true emotions even when people tried to hide them. I could feel tension in a jaw that indicated anger being suppressed. I could feel the slight trembling of lips that meant someone was fighting back tears. I could feel the rapid pulse in someone's neck that revealed fear or excitement. I could feel the temperature of skin and know if someone had a fever or was experiencing strong emotions that increased blood flow. I could identify objects by touch with perfect accuracy, not just recognizing what they were, but perceiving details that sighted people often missed. The grain of wood, the weave of fabric, the tiny imperfections in metal or glass. I could navigate complex spaces by touch and memory, building detailed mental maps of every room, every building, every path I traveled. I could move through the plantation in complete darkness, which was always my reality, with a confidence and speed that often startled people who watched me. And finally, my mind developed in ways that compensated for my blindness. My memory became prodigious. I never forgot a sound, a smell, a texture, a conversation, a piece of information. Everything I perceived was stored away in perfect detail, ready to be recalled whenever I needed it. My ability to recognize patterns became extraordinary. I could detect subtle connections and correlations that others missed, could predict behavior based on tiny changes in routine, could solve problems by analyzing information in ways that didn't rely on visual input. I developed what my mother called the knowing, an almost intuitive sense of what was happening around me, built from the constant processing of thousands of sensory inputs that my brain wove together into a coherent understanding of my environment. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't useless. I was different, and that difference gave me abilities that sighted people didn't have, couldn't even imagine. But I learned very early to hide the full extent of my capabilities. In a world where enslaved people were punished for being too smart, too capable, too aware, I understood that revealing my extraordinary perceptual abilities would make me dangerous in the eyes of white people. So I played the role they expected, the helpless blind woman who needed guidance and supervision, who couldn't possibly understand what was happening around her, who posed no threat to anyone. I kept my head down, my mouth shut, and my secrets hidden. And I survived. I worked on the Whitfield plantation in North Carolina until I was 25 years old. Performing simple tasks in the kitchen and laundry that didn't require sight, I peeled vegetables, washed dishes, folded clothes, ground corn, churned butter, repetitive work that I could do by touch and muscle memory. The other enslaved people were kind to me, protective, always making sure I had what I needed. My mother worked in the fields until her body gave out when I was 23, and she died 2 years later of exhaustion and a lung disease that I could smell on her for months before she finally succumbed. Her death devastated me, but I had no time to grieve properly. 3 months after my mother died, Master Whitfield died as well, and his estate was liquidated to pay his debts. All of the enslaved people were sold, scattered to different buyers, families torn apart. The community that had been my entire world destroyed in a single afternoon. I was sold to a slave trader named Perkins, who specialized in what he called discount merchandise, enslaved people who were old, sick, disabled, or otherwise considered less valuable. He bought me for $30, a pittance compared to what healthy young slaves sold for, and added me to a coffle of 24 other defective slaves that he planned to sell in various markets throughout the South. For the next 5 years, I was bought and sold 6 times, passed from owner to owner like a piece of broken furniture that nobody really wanted but that someone might find a use for. Each owner was disappointed to discover that a blind slave wasn't as useful as they'd hoped, and each one eventually sold me at a loss. My price dropped steadily, from $30 to $20 to $15 to $10 to $5. By the time I ended up at that Charleston auction in May of 1852, I was worth only 25 cents, less than a pound of coffee, less than a cheap pair of shoes. I was 30 years old, and I had been bought and sold 7 times. I had worked in kitchens and laundries across Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. I had survived brutal masters and indifferent masters, and occasionally almost kind masters. I had learned to adapt to new environments quickly, to make myself useful enough to avoid being sold to the horrific sugar plantations of Louisiana or the cotton plantations of the Deep South, where slaves were literally worked to death. I had learned to be invisible, to be overlooked, to be dismissed as harmless. And I had learned to watch and listen and remember everything, storing away information about the people around me, about their secrets and their crimes and their vulnerabilities. I didn't know why I did this, didn't know if the information would ever be useful. I just did it instinctively, perhaps because knowledge was the only power I had in a world where I had no power at all. Josiah Caldwell was 42 years old when he bought me for 25 cents at that Charleston auction. He was a successful merchant who had made his fortune in cotton trading and land speculation, buying cheap properties and selling them at inflated prices to newcomers who didn't know the market. He owned a large, elegant house on Meeting Street in the heart of Charleston's wealthy district, a showcase of his success with its 3 stories, its white columns, its manicured gardens, its expensive imported furnishings. He also owned a small plantation about 15 miles outside the city, where he grew rice and indigo with the labor of about 30 enslaved people. Caldwell was considered a respectable member of Charleston society, a vestryman at St. Michael's Church, a member of the Chamber of Commerce, a donor to various charitable causes. He was married to a woman named Catherine Thornton Caldwell, the daughter of a wealthy Georgia planter, and their marriage had brought him not only social status, but also a substantial dowry of $50,000 and several hundred acres of prime cotton land. To the outside world, Josiah Caldwell was a successful, respectable, upstanding citizen. But I would soon discover that behind that carefully maintained facade was a man capable of monstrous crimes. Caldwell bought me on a whim, barely paying attention to the transaction. He had come to the auction looking for a strong young field hand for his plantation, But all the prime slaves had already been sold by the time he arrived. Annoyed at having wasted his time, he was about to leave when the auctioneer began the sale of the defective slaves. Caldwell paused, half listening, when the auctioneer described me. A blind kitchen worker for 25 cents? It was such a trivial amount that he decided to make the purchase just to avoid leaving empty-handed. He could always use another kitchen worker at his Charleston house, and even a blind one might be able to perform simple tasks under supervision. If she turned out to be completely useless, well, he'd only wasted a quarter. He collected me from the auction house, had one of his house slaves lead me to his carriage, and transported me to his Meeting Street residence without speaking a single word to me. I sat in the back of the carriage, my hands folded in my lap, my face carefully blank, while my other senses worked frantically to gather information about my new owner and my new situation. I listened to Caldwell's breathing, steady, controlled, the breathing of a man accustomed to authority and comfort. I smelled his cologne, expensive with notes of bergamot and sandalwood. I smelled his clothes, fine wool, recently cleaned, with the faint scent of tobacco smoke embedded in the fibers. I smelled something else too, something that made me uneasy, a faint chemical smell that I couldn't quite identify, something medicinal or perhaps toxic, clinging to his hands. I filed that information away, not knowing what it meant, but knowing it might be important. The Caldwell house on Meeting Street was the most luxurious place I had ever been. Even though I couldn't see it, I could perceive its grandeur through my other senses. The floors were polished hardwood that echoed with footsteps. The furniture was expensive. I could tell by the quality of the wood when I touched it, by the fine fabrics of the upholstery. The air smelled of beeswax candles, fresh flowers, expensive perfumes, and the underlying scent of wealth and privilege. I was taken to the kitchen, a large room at the back of the house with a massive hearth, multiple work tables, and shelves lined with pots, pans, and dishes. The head cook, an enslaved woman named Aunt Bess, was waiting for me. Aunt Bess was 62 years old, I could tell by her voice, which had the particular quality that comes with age, and by her scent, which carried the accumulated years of hard work and the beginning of the physical decline that comes to everyone eventually. She had been with the Caldwell family for over 40 years, had been inherited by Josiah from his father, and she ran the kitchen with firm, efficient authority. She looked me over with obvious skepticism, her breathing pattern indicating doubt and mild irritation. "So you're blind," she said bluntly. "Can you work, or are you going to be more trouble than you're worth?" "I can work, Ma'am," I said quietly, keeping my eyes downcast in the submissive posture that was expected. "I've worked in kitchens before. I can peel vegetables, wash dishes, prepare simple foods clean. I don't need eyes to do those things." Aunt Bess made a skeptical sound but decided to give me a chance. "We'll see. I'm going to start you with the simplest tasks. You'll peel potatoes and carrots, wash dishes, scrub pots, sweep floors. You'll work in that corner by the hearth where you won't be in the way. Don't wander around the kitchen. You'll just bump into things and cause problems. Don't touch anything unless I tell you to. And for God's sake, don't break any of the mistress's good china, or Master Caldwell will have both our hides. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am, I understand." Aunt Bess assigned me a stool in the corner near the large cooking hearth, gave me a basin of water and a pile of potatoes, and set me to work peeling. I settled into the familiar rhythm of the task, my hands moving automatically, the knife removing the potato skins in smooth, efficient strips. I had peeled thousands of potatoes in my life, and I could do it perfectly without any need for sight. But while my hands worked, my other senses were busy absorbing every detail of my new environment. I listened to the sounds of the house, learning its rhythms and patterns. I could hear footsteps on the floors above, the heavy, confident tread of Master Caldwell, the lighter, more hesitant steps of Mistress Catherine, the quick, efficient movements of the house slaves going about their duties. I could hear voices, muffled by distance and walls but still audible to my sensitive ears. I could hear the creak of floorboards, the opening and closing of doors, the ticking of a clock in a nearby room. I built a mental map of the house's layout based on sound, tracking where people went, which rooms were used for what purposes, the daily routines that governed life in this wealthy household. I smelled everything, The food being prepared in the kitchen, the wood smoke from the hearth, the various scents of the people who lived and worked in the house. Each person had a distinctive smell that I memorized. Master Caldwell smelled of expensive cologne, tobacco, wool suits, and that faint chemical odor I had noticed in the carriage. Mistress Catherine had a delicate scent of lavender water and rose perfume, but underneath it, I detected something troubling. The sour smell of sickness, the chemical changes in her body that indicated she was unwell. Aunt Bess smelled of cooking spices, wood smoke, and the particular scent of someone who had worked hard for many years. The other kitchen workers, two young women named Sarah and Mary, had their own distinctive scents that I quickly learned to recognize, and I listened to the conversations that happened around me. Aunt Bess talked constantly while she cooked, a running commentary of instructions and observations. Sarah and Mary gossiped whenever Aunt Bess's attention was elsewhere, their voices dropping to whispers that they thought were private, but that I could hear perfectly. Through their conversations, I began to piece together an understanding of the Caldwell household and the people who lived in it. Master Caldwell was a demanding employer, quick to anger, harsh in his punishments, feared by all the enslaved people in his household. He had a reputation in Charleston as a shrewd businessman, but there were whispers that some of his business practices were not entirely honest, that he had made his fortune through questionable deals and outright fraud. Mistress Catherine was the daughter of a wealthy Georgia planter named Robert Thornton. She had married Josiah Caldwell 8 years ago in a match arranged by her father, bringing a substantial dowry that had allowed Caldwell to expand his business significantly. But the marriage was not a happy one. Catherine was sickly, spending most of her time in her bedroom on the second floor, rarely coming downstairs, rarely entertaining guests or participating in Charleston society. There were no children, which was a source of tension. Catherine had suffered 3 miscarriages in the first 5 years of marriage, and there had been no pregnancies in the last 3 years. The whispers suggested that Caldwell blamed his wife for failing to produce an heir, that he resented her constant illness, that he had grown cold and distant toward her. The household staff consisted of about a dozen enslaved people. Aunt Bess ran the kitchen with the help of Sarah and Mary. There was a butler named Samuel, a dignified man in his 50s, who managed the front of the house. There were 2 housemaids who cleaned and maintained the upstairs rooms. There was a laundress, a gardener, a stable hand who cared for Caldwell's horses and carriage, and several others whose specific roles I learned over time. All of them were afraid of Master Caldwell, walked on eggshells around him, spoke in hushed voices about his temper and his punishments. And there were darker whispers too, whispers about Caldwell's treatment of the young enslaved women, about his visits to the slave quarters on his plantation, about things that happened in the darkness that no one spoke about openly, but that everyone knew. I absorbed all of this information, storing it away, building a detailed understanding of the world I had entered. And then, 2 weeks after my arrival, I smelled something that changed everything. I was in the kitchen peeling carrots when Master Caldwell came downstairs carrying a tray with his wife's lunch dishes. He had taken the meal up to her himself, which was unusual. Normally one of the housemaids did that. As he passed near my corner, walking toward the scullery to leave the tray for washing, I caught a scent that made every nerve in my body go on alert. Bitter almonds, faint but unmistakable, mixed with the smell of the beef broth that had been on Mistress Catherine's tray. Bitter almonds. I knew that smell. I had encountered it once before, years ago on the Whitfield plantation in North Carolina, when rat poison had been used in the barn. The poison contained arsenic, and arsenic had a distinctive smell. Bitter almonds. Why would Mistress Catherine's lunch smell like arsenic? I said nothing, gave no indication that I had noticed anything unusual. I kept my head down, my hands moving steadily over the carrots, my face blank, but my mind was racing. Had I really smelled arsenic? Could I be mistaken? I replayed the scent in my memory, analyzing it, comparing it to the smell I remembered from years ago. No, I wasn't mistaken. It was definitely the bitter almond smell of arsenic, faint but present, mixed with the beef broth, which meant that Master Caldwell had put arsenic in his wife's food, which meant he was poisoning her. I felt a cold chill run through my body. I had stumbled onto something terrible, something dangerous. Josiah Caldwell was murdering his wife slowly and carefully, making it look like natural illness. And he thought no one could see what he was doing because the only person consistently near him in the kitchen was a blind slave woman who couldn't possibly witness anything. But I had witnessed it. I had smelled the poison, and now I had to decide what to do with that knowledge. Over the next several days, I paid careful attention every time Master Caldwell brought down his wife's meal trays. Not every meal smelled of arsenic. He was being careful, spacing out the doses so the poisoning would appear to be a natural wasting disease rather than acute poisoning. But I detected the bitter almond scent often enough to confirm the pattern. He was poisoning her regularly, systematically, patiently waiting for the accumulated doses to kill her. And I noticed other things too. I noticed the particular way Caldwell walked when he went upstairs to his wife's room. A careful, deliberate gait, different from his normal, confident stride. He was being cautious, making sure no one was watching, preparing to commit his crime. I noticed the changes in his breathing when the doctor came to examine Mistress Catherine. A slight elevation in his heart rate, a subtle tension in his respiration that indicated anxiety or stress. He was worried about being discovered, even though he was confident in his deception. I noticed the smell of nervous sweat on him when the doctor discussed Catherine's symptoms and prognosis. And I listened to those discussions, my sensitive ears picking up every word, even though they took place in the parlor on the other side of the house from the kitchen. The doctor, a man named Dr. Harrison, was baffled by Mistress Catherine's condition. Her symptoms are consistent with a wasting disease, he told Caldwell during one visit. The chronic stomach pains, the nausea and vomiting, the progressive weakness, the weight loss. It could be cancer of the stomach or intestines, though I cannot be certain without a post-mortem examination. I'm afraid there is very little I can do except prescribe laudanum for the pain and recommend that she be kept comfortable. These wasting diseases are often fatal, Mr. Caldwell. You should prepare yourself for the possibility that your wife may not recover. Caldwell's response was perfectly calibrated, concerned, sorrowful, the devoted husband facing the impending loss of his beloved wife. Is there nothing more that can be done, doctor? No treatment, no medicine that might help her? I'm afraid not. We simply don't understand these diseases well enough to treat them effectively. I'm very sorry, Mr. Caldwell. I know this must be terribly difficult for you. But I could hear the lie in Caldwell's voice, could smell the deception in his sweat. He wasn't grieving, he was performing grief, playing the role of the concerned husband while secretly administering the poison that was killing his wife. And I understood why. With Catherine dead, Caldwell would inherit her substantial fortune, the dowry her father had provided, plus the property she had inherited when her mother died 2 years ago. He would be a wealthy widower, free to remarry, free to produce the heir he wanted with a younger, healthier wife. Catherine's death would solve all his problems, and no one would ever suspect murder, because her symptoms looked exactly like a natural wasting disease. Now I know some of you watching this are wondering what Esther will do with this terrible knowledge, whether she'll find a way to expose Caldwell's crime, or whether she'll be forced to remain silent. If you're gripped by this story of extraordinary perception and the fight for justice against impossible odds, leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Because Esther's journey is about to take a dramatic turn that will test everything she's learned about survival and justice. I watched, or rather, listened and smelled and sensed, as Josiah Caldwell slowly murdered his wife over the course of 3 months. I detected the poison in her food at least twice a week, sometimes more often. I heard Mistress Catherine's condition deteriorate, heard her groans of pain through the ceiling, heard the doctor's increasingly pessimistic reports, heard the household staff whispering that the mistress wouldn't last much longer. And I said nothing. What could I say? Who would believe me? I was a slave, and a blind one at that. If I accused Master Caldwell of murder, I would be whipped for insolence, sold away, possibly killed. My testimony would be worthless in any court of law. Slaves couldn't testify against white people, except in the most extraordinary circumstances. And even then their testimony was rarely believed. So I kept silent and hated myself for it, hated my powerlessness. hated the system that made me complicit in murder simply by forcing me to witness it without being able to stop it. But I also paid attention to everything, storing away every detail, every piece of evidence, building a case in my mind even though I had no idea if I would ever be able to use it. I memorized the pattern of poisoning, which meals contained arsenic, how often the doses were administered, the progression of Catherine's symptoms. I memorized the sound of Caldwell's footsteps when he went to her room, the particular rhythm and weight that indicated he was carrying poisoned food. I memorized the smell of the arsenic, the specific chemical signature that I would recognize anywhere. I memorized the changes in Caldwell's behavior and demeanor, the subtle signs of deception and guilt that his body betrayed even when his words and actions were perfectly controlled. And I discovered that Caldwell's crimes extended beyond the murder of his wife. As I listened to the conversations that took place in the house, as I paid attention to the comings and goings of visitors, as I absorbed every scrap of information that came my way, I learned that Josiah Caldwell was a man who committed crimes as casually as other people breathed. He cheated his business partners, lying about property values and pocketing the difference when sales were made. I heard him discussing these fraudulent deals with an associate, heard them laughing about how easy it was to deceive the fools who trusted them. He bribed city officials to overlook building code violations and zoning restrictions, allowing him to develop properties that should never have been approved. I heard him arranging these bribes, heard the clink of coins changing hands, heard the corrupt officials thanking him for his generosity. He forged documents, imitating other people's signatures to steal business opportunities and claim ownership of properties that weren't his. I heard him practicing these forgeries, heard the scratch of pen on paper as he copied someone else's handwriting over and over until he had it perfect. And he abused the enslaved women in his household, particularly Sarah, one of the young kitchen workers. Sarah was 18 years old, pretty, and absolutely terrified of Caldwell. I could hear her fear in the way her breathing changed when he entered a room, could smell the anxiety that poured off her in waves, and I could hear what happened when Caldwell summoned her to his study late at night after his wife had gone to bed. I could hear Sarah's muffled crying, could hear the sounds of violence and violation, could smell her shame and pain when she returned to the kitchen afterward. Caldwell was not just a murderer. He was a rapist, a fraud, a man who used his wealth and power to take whatever he wanted from people who had no ability to refuse or resist. Mistress Catherine Caldwell died on a humid night in late August, 3.5 months after I arrived at the house. I was sleeping on my pallet in the kitchen when I heard the commotion upstairs, Caldwell's shout for help, the sound of running feet, the arrival of Dr. Harrison. By morning, the entire household was in mourning. Catherine had passed away in her sleep, the doctor announced. Her long illness had finally claimed her. It was a mercy, really, that she was no longer suffering. The funeral was held 3 days later at St. Michael's Church, one of the grandest churches in Charleston. Half of Charleston's elite society attended, filling the pews, offering condolences to the grieving widower. I stood in the back of the church with the other Caldwell slaves, listening to the minister's eulogy, listening to the hypocritical expressions of sympathy, listening to Josiah Caldwell play his role perfectly, the devastated husband, voice choked with emotion, accepting condolences with dignified sorrow. And I listened to the lies, smelled the deception, and knew the truth that no one else knew. After the funeral, life in the Caldwell household changed. Caldwell was lighter, more energetic, like a man who had been carrying a heavy burden and had finally set it down. He began going out more frequently, attending social events, entertaining guests at the house. He began making plans to expand his business, investing Catherine's inherited fortune in new ventures. And he began paying even more attention to Sarah, calling her to his study more frequently, his abuse of her becoming more brazen now that his wife was no longer in the house to potentially discover it. I continued my work in the kitchen, peeling vegetables, washing dishes, staying in my corner, playing the role of the harmless blind woman who saw nothing and knew nothing. But I was watching everything, listening to everything, remembering everything. And I was waiting, though I didn't know what I was waiting for. Then, 6 weeks after Catherine's death, everything changed. Catherine's brother, a man named Robert Thornton, arrived in Charleston from his plantation in Georgia. Robert was 45 years old, a wealthy planter who had inherited his father's estate and his father's slaves. He was a different kind of man than Caldwell, quieter, more thoughtful, with a sense of honor and decency that was rare among slaveholders. He had loved his sister deeply, and her death had devastated him. But it had also raised questions in his mind. Catherine had been sick, yes, but her decline had been so rapid, so severe, that it didn't quite match the pattern of the wasting disease Dr. Harrison had diagnosed. And Robert had heard rumors about Caldwell, whispers about his business practices, about his treatment of enslaved people, about his character. So he had come to Charleston to settle his sister's estate, but also to ask questions, to investigate, to see if there was any truth to his growing suspicions that something wasn't right about Catherine's death. Robert came to the Caldwell house and requested permission to speak with the household slaves. Caldwell couldn't refuse without arousing suspicion, so he agreed, though I could hear the tension in his voice, could smell the anxiety in his sweat. Robert interviewed each of the slaves privately, asking them about Catherine's final months, about her illness, about anything unusual they might have noticed. Most of the slaves were too frightened to say anything substantive. They gave vague, careful answers, afraid of Caldwell's retaliation if they spoke against him. But when Robert asked to speak with me, something shifted. Perhaps it was because I was blind, and he assumed I couldn't have witnessed anything important. Perhaps it was because he was desperate for information and willing to try anything. Perhaps it was simply fate. Whatever the reason, Robert Thornton sat down with me in the kitchen, dismissed the other slaves so we could speak privately, and asked me a simple question. "Esther, did you notice anything unusual about my sister's illness? Anything at all that seemed strange or out of place?" And I made a decision. I decided to tell the truth. I decided to risk everything, my safety, my life, whatever small measure of security I had, to seek justice for a woman I had barely known, but whose murder I had been forced to witness. "Master Thornton," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me, "I may be blind, but I am not deaf and I am not without sense. I know what happened to your sister. Master Caldwell poisoned her. He put arsenic in her food slowly over the course of 3 months until she died. I smelled it every time he brought down her meal trays. I heard him preparing the doses. I know what he did." The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear Robert's breathing stop, then restart with a sharp intake of breath. I could hear his heart begin to pound, the rapid rhythm audible to my sensitive ears. I could smell the sudden surge of adrenaline in his system, the chemical signature of shock and rage. "That's an extremely serious accusation," he said finally, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "How can you possibly know this? You're blind. You couldn't have seen anything." "I didn't see it, sir. I smelled it. Arsenic has a distinctive odor, bitter almonds. I smelled it on your sister's meal trays multiple times over 3 months. I also heard Master Caldwell's footsteps when he went to her room. A careful, deliberate pattern, different from his normal walk. I heard the changes in his breathing when Dr. Harrison asked questions about her illness. I heard the lies in his voice. I may not have eyes, sir, but I have ears and a nose and a mind, and I know what I perceived." Robert was silent for a long moment, and I could hear him struggling to process what I had told him, struggling to decide whether to believe the testimony of a blind slave woman or to dismiss it as impossible. "If what you're saying is true," he said slowly, "then my brother-in-law is a murderer, but you're a slave. Your testimony wouldn't be admissible in any court. No judge would allow it, no jury would believe it." "I know, sir," I said, "but I'm telling you anyway because you asked, and because your sister deserves justice, and because I can't stay silent anymore. I've been forced to witness a murder and say nothing, and it's been eating away at my soul. So I'm telling you the truth, and you can do with it whatever you think is right." Robert stood up and I could hear him pacing, his footsteps agitated, his breathing rapid. "If I accuse Caldwell of murder based on your testimony, he'll deny it. He'll say you're lying, that you're delusional, that a blind slave couldn't possibly know what she claims to know. And most people will believe him, not you. But," he paused, and I could hear the determination building in his voice, "but if there's any way to prove what you're saying, any way to demonstrate that your perceptions are accurate and reliable, then I'm going to find it. because I loved my sister, and if she was murdered, then by God, her killer will pay for it. Robert Thornton launched an investigation. He hired a lawyer, a man named Samuel Pierce, who had studied law in Boston and had abolitionist sympathies. Pierce was willing to take on controversial cases, willing to challenge the legal system, willing to fight for justice even when the odds were stacked against him. Together, Robert and Pierce began building a case against Josiah Caldwell. They interviewed all of the Caldwell household slaves again, this time with Pierce present, carefully documenting their statements. They examined Catherine's medical records, consulting with multiple doctors about her symptoms and whether they were consistent with arsenic poisoning. The doctors confirmed that chronic arsenic poisoning could indeed produce symptoms identical to a wasting disease, stomach pains, nausea, vomiting, progressive weakness, weight loss. They investigated Caldwell's finances and discovered that he had been heavily in debt before Catherine's death, but had suddenly become solvent afterward, having inherited her substantial estate. They discovered that Caldwell had purchased arsenic from an apothecary 3 months before Catherine's illness began, claiming he needed it for rat poison on his plantation. The circumstantial evidence was strong, but Pierce knew it wasn't enough for a conviction. What they needed was direct evidence, eyewitness testimony that could prove Caldwell had administered the poison. And the only direct witness was me, a blind slave woman whose testimony would normally never be allowed in court. Pierce came up with a radical, unprecedented idea. He would petition the court to allow me to testify, and he would demonstrate my abilities publicly, proving that despite my blindness, I was a credible, reliable witness whose perceptions were accurate and trustworthy. It was a long shot, a legal gamble that had never been attempted before. Slaves could testify in court only in very limited circumstances, usually in cases involving other slaves. A slave testifying against a white person was almost unheard of, and a blind slave had never testified at all. The assumption was that a blind person couldn't possibly be a reliable witness to anything. But Pierce was determined, and Robert Thornton was willing to fund the legal battle, and together they pushed forward with a case that would challenge the very foundations of the legal system. The petition was filed in October of 1852, and it caused an immediate sensation. The Charleston newspapers picked up the story, running headlines like "Blind Slave to Testify in Murder Case" and "Unprecedented Legal Challenge Rocks Charleston Society." Public opinion was sharply divided. Abolitionists saw the case as an opportunity to demonstrate that enslaved people were intelligent, perceptive, and deserving of legal rights. Pro-slavery advocates saw it as a dangerous precedent that would undermine the social order and encourage slaves to make false accusations against their masters. And the general public was simply fascinated. Could a blind woman really be a credible witness? Could she really have perceived things that sighted people had missed? The case became the talk of Charleston, dominating conversations in parlors and taverns and churches. The judge assigned to the case was a man named Henry Whitmore, a respected jurist in his 60s with a reputation for fairness and intellectual rigor. Judge Whitmore was not an abolitionist. He owned slaves himself and believed in the institution, but he also believed in the rule of law and in the pursuit of truth. He was intrigued by the legal questions the case raised and willing to consider arguments that other judges might have dismissed out of hand. He agreed to hold a preliminary hearing to determine whether my testimony should be allowed. The hearing would include a series of tests to demonstrate my abilities, to prove that despite my blindness, I could perceive and remember details with accuracy and reliability. If I passed these tests, Judge Whitmore would consider allowing me to testify at trial, a decision that would be unprecedented in Southern legal history. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for November 15, 1852, and it would be held in the main courtroom of the Charleston County Courthouse, open to the public. The courtroom was packed on the day of the hearing. Every seat was filled, with people standing in the aisles and crowding around the doors, eager to witness this extraordinary event. The spectators included plantation owners, merchants, lawyers, doctors, journalists, and even a few free black people who had somehow obtained permission to attend. The atmosphere was electric, charged with curiosity and tension, and the sense that something historic was about to happen. I was brought into the courtroom wearing a simple dress, my hands trembling with nervousness, my heart pounding so hard I thought everyone must be able to hear it. I had never been in a courtroom before, had never been the center of so much attention, had never faced a challenge this important. But I was determined to tell the truth, to demonstrate my abilities, to seek justice for Catherine Caldwell and for all the other victims of Josiah Caldwell's crimes. Judge Whitmore called the hearing to order and explained its purpose. We are here today to determine whether this woman, Esther, despite her blindness, possesses the perceptual abilities and mental faculties necessary to serve as a credible witness in a criminal trial. This is an unusual situation, and we will proceed carefully and methodically. Mr. Pierce, you may begin your demonstration. Samuel Pierce stood and addressed the court. Your Honor, I intend to prove that Esther's blindness has not diminished her ability to perceive and understand the world around her. On the contrary, her other senses have developed to an extraordinary degree, compensating for her lack of sight and giving her perceptual abilities that in some ways exceed those of sighted people. I will demonstrate this through a series of tests that will show her remarkable auditory, olfactory, and tactile perception. Pierce had designed 5 tests, each one carefully crafted to showcase a different aspect of my abilities. The first test involved auditory identification. Pierce brought 10 people into the courtroom, a mix of men and women, young and old, from different social classes. He had each person walk across the courtroom from one side to the other while I listened. Then he had them all stand in a line, and he asked me to identify each person by the sound of their footsteps alone. I listened carefully as each person walked, paying attention to the rhythm of their gait, the weight of their step, the sound their shoes made against the wooden floor, the subtle differences in how each person moved. Then I pointed to each person in turn and described them. That's a heavy man, probably over 200 pounds, wearing leather boots with a slight heel. He walks with confidence, putting his weight on his heels. That's a woman, lighter, maybe 130 pounds, wearing soft-soled shoes. She walks quickly with short steps. That's an older man, probably in his 60s, with a slight limp in his left leg. He's wearing hard-soled shoes that click against the floor. I went through all 10 people, describing each one accurately based solely on the sound of their footsteps. Pierce then revealed their identities and had them confirm my descriptions. Every single one was correct. The courtroom murmured with surprise and interest. The second test involved olfactory identification. Pierce had collected personal items from 5 different people: a handkerchief, a glove, a hat, a scarf, and a coat. He brought these items to me one at a time and asked me to smell them and describe the person who owned each item. I held each item close to my face, breathing in deeply, analyzing the complex mixture of scents that clung to the fabric. This handkerchief belongs to a woman who uses lavender water and rose perfume. She's young, probably in her 20s. She doesn't do physical labor. Her scent doesn't have the smell of sweat or dirt. She's wealthy, based on the quality of the perfume. This glove belongs to a man who smokes tobacco and drinks whiskey. He's middle-aged, probably in his 40s. He works with his hands. I can smell leather and oil and wood. This hat belongs to an older woman who uses a different perfume, something with jasmine. She has a medical condition. I can smell the chemical changes in her body, something related to her liver or kidneys. I went through all 5 items, providing detailed descriptions of their owners based solely on scent. Pierce then brought in the 5 people who owned the items, and they confirmed that my descriptions were accurate. The courtroom was now buzzing with excited conversation. People were leaning forward in their seats, completely absorbed in the demonstration. The third test involved tactile identification. Pierce brought me a series of objects: a pocket watch, a book, a piece of fabric, a coin, a key, a small carved wooden box, a piece of jewelry, a tool, a writing implement, and a decorative item. He handed me each object and asked me to identify it and describe it in detail using only my sense of touch. I ran my fingers over each item carefully, feeling every surface, every texture, every detail. This is a pocket watch, silver, with a smooth case that has a small dent on the back, probably from being dropped. The crystal over the face is slightly scratched. The watch is warm, which means it was recently carried in someone's pocket. This is a book, leather-bound, well-worn. The pages have been turned many times. I can feel the oils from fingers on the edges. The leather is expensive, probably imported. This is silk fabric, high quality, with a tight weave. The pattern is raised, I can feel it with my fingertips. This is a coin, a silver dollar, minted recently based on the sharpness of the details. This is a key, iron, for a large lock, probably a door lock rather than a padlock. I went through all 10 objects, identifying each one correctly and providing details that amazed the spectators. The fourth test was the most dramatic and the most controversial. Pierce wanted to demonstrate that I could detect deception, that I could tell when someone was lying based on subtle changes in their voice, breathing, and body chemistry. He selected 5 people from the courtroom audience and asked each one to make a statement, some true, some false. Then he asked me to identify which statements were lies and which were truths. This was risky. Detecting deception is not an exact science, even for someone with my abilities, but I had been doing it my entire life, had learned to read the subtle signs that people's bodies betrayed when they lied. I listened carefully to each person's statement, paying attention not just to their words, but to their breathing, their heart rate, the tension in their voice, the chemical changes in their body that produced the faint smell of nervous sweat. "That man is lying," I said, pointing to a merchant who had claimed he had never met Josiah Caldwell. His breathing accelerated when he spoke, and his voice had a slight tremor. He's nervous because he's not telling the truth. Pierce investigated and discovered that the merchant had indeed done business with Caldwell and had lied to avoid being associated with the case. "That woman is telling the truth," I said, pointing to a woman who had claimed she had witnessed Caldwell purchasing arsenic from an apothecary. "Her breathing is steady, her voice is calm, and there's no smell of nervous sweat. She's confident because she's telling the truth." Pierce confirmed that the woman's statement was accurate. I went through all 5 people, correctly identifying 4 out of 5 lies and truths. The one I got wrong was a borderline case where the person was telling a partial truth, and I had misread the ambiguity. But 4 out of 5 was still an impressive demonstration of my ability to detect deception. The courtroom was now in an uproar, with people talking excitedly, arguing about what they had witnessed, debating whether it was possible for a blind person to have such abilities. Judge Whitmore banged his gavel for order. "This is extraordinary," he said, his voice filled with genuine amazement. "I have been a judge for 30 years, and I have never witnessed anything like this. This woman clearly possesses perceptual abilities that are remarkable, perhaps even unprecedented. Mr. Pierce, I am inclined to allow her testimony. However, I want to hear from the defense before I make my final ruling. Mr. Harrison, you represent the defendant, Josiah Caldwell. Do you have any objections to this testimony?" Caldwell's attorney, a man named William Harrison, stood up. He was one of the most expensive and skilled defense lawyers in Charleston, experienced in defending wealthy clients accused of crimes. He was not going to concede defeat easily. "Your Honor," Harrison said smoothly, "this demonstration has been impressive, I'll grant you that. But it doesn't change several fundamental facts. First, this woman is a slave. The law is very clear about when slave testimony is admissible, and those circumstances are extremely limited. Allowing a slave to testify against a white man in a murder trial would set a dangerous precedent that could undermine the entire social order of our society. Second, even if we set aside her status as a slave, she is blind. How can a blind person be considered a reliable witness? She admits she didn't see anything. All of her testimony would be based on what she claims to have heard and smelled, which is inherently unreliable and subject to misinterpretation. Third, she has a clear motive to lie. If Mr. Caldwell is convicted, she will likely be freed as a reward for her testimony. She has every incentive to make false accusations in order to gain her freedom. For these reasons, Your Honor, I respectfully submit that her testimony should not be allowed." Pierce stood to respond. "Your Honor, Mr. Harrison's arguments are based on outdated assumptions and prejudices, not on the evidence we've seen today. Yes, Esther is a slave, but the law does allow slave testimony in cases where no other evidence is available and where the testimony is deemed credible. This is precisely such a case. Yes, she is blind, But we have just demonstrated that her other senses are extraordinarily acute and reliable. She has correctly identified people, objects, and even deception with a level of accuracy that exceeds what many sighted witnesses could achieve. As for motive, every witness has some motive for testifying. That doesn't automatically make their testimony unreliable. The question is whether the testimony is truthful and accurate, and we have just proven that Esther's perceptions are both. Your Honor, justice demands that we hear her testimony. A woman has been murdered, and the only person who can provide direct evidence of that murder is standing before you. To exclude her testimony simply because she is blind and enslaved would be to allow a murderer to go free and to deny justice to the victim. Judge Whitmore considered both arguments carefully. The courtroom was silent, everyone waiting to hear his decision. Finally, he spoke. This is one of the most difficult decisions I have faced in my career as a judge. The law regarding slave testimony is restrictive, and for good reasons. We cannot allow our courts to be flooded with unreliable accusations from people who have every reason to resent their masters. However, this case is exceptional in every way. The demonstration we have witnessed today proves beyond any doubt that this woman possesses extraordinary perceptual abilities. She has shown that she can accurately identify people, objects, and even deception using senses other than sight. Her blindness, rather than disqualifying her as a witness, has actually enhanced her other senses to a degree that makes her potentially more reliable than many sighted witnesses. Furthermore, this is a murder case. If the allegations are true, a heinous crime has been committed, and justice demands that we pursue the truth wherever it leads us. I am going to allow Esther to testify at trial. However, I will instruct the jury carefully about how to evaluate her testimony, and I will allow the defense to cross-examine her thoroughly. If her testimony proves to be unreliable or inconsistent, the jury will be free to disregard it. But she will have her day in court. This hearing is adjourned. The courtroom erupted in chaos, some people cheering, others shouting in outrage, everyone talking at once. Josiah Caldwell sat at the defense table, his face pale, his hands clenched into fists. He looked at me with pure hatred, and I could smell his rage, his fear, his disbelief that a blind slave woman he had bought for 25 cents was about to destroy his life. The trial was scheduled to begin in December of 1852. I had won the right to testify, but the real battle was just beginning. I would have to face Caldwell in court, would have to tell my story in front of a jury of white men who might not believe me, would have to withstand a brutal cross-examination designed to discredit me and make me look like a liar or a fool. But I was ready. I had been preparing for this moment my entire life, even though I hadn't known it. Every skill I had developed, every sense I had honed, every piece of information I had stored away, it had all been leading to this. I was going to seek justice for Catherine Caldwell. I was going to expose Josiah Caldwell for the monster he was. And I was going to prove that a blind slave woman could see the truth more clearly than anyone with eyes. The trial of Josiah Caldwell began on December 1st, 1852, and it was the most sensational legal proceeding Charleston had seen in years. The courtroom was packed every single day, with people arriving hours early to secure seats, with journalists from newspapers as far away as New York and Boston attending to cover the story. The case had captured the public imagination, a wealthy, respected merchant accused of murdering his wife, with the key witness being a blind slave woman who claimed to have perceived the crime through her other senses. It was unprecedented, dramatic, and deeply controversial. Samuel Pierce presented the prosecution's case methodically and carefully. He called medical experts who testified about arsenic poisoning, explaining how chronic exposure to small doses could produce symptoms identical to a wasting disease. He called the apothecary who had sold arsenic to Caldwell 3 months before Catherine's illness began. He called financial experts who testified about Caldwell's debts and about the substantial fortune he had inherited upon his wife's death. He called several of the Caldwell household slaves who testified about the tension in the marriage, about Catherine's rapid decline, about Caldwell's strange behavior during his wife's illness. The circumstantial evidence was strong, but everyone knew that the case would ultimately hinge on my testimony. I was called to the witness stand on the 4th day of the trial. I walked to the front of the courtroom, guided by Samuel Pierce, and took my seat in the witness box. I could hear the rustle of hundreds of people shifting in their seats, could smell the mixture of perfumes and sweat and anticipation that filled the room, could feel the weight of all those eyes on me even though I couldn't see them. Judge Whitmore addressed me directly. "Esther, you are about to give testimony in this court. Do you understand the importance of telling the truth?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said, my voice steady despite my nervousness. "I understand." "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I do, Your Honor." Pierce began his direct examination gently, establishing my background and my abilities. He asked me about my life, about how I had learned to compensate for my blindness, about the development of my other senses. He asked me to describe how I perceived the world, how I identified people and objects, how I detected emotions and deception. And then he asked me about my time in the Caldwell household, about what I had perceived during the 3 months leading up to Catherine Caldwell's death. I told my story clearly and calmly, describing everything I had witnessed. I described the first time I smelled the bitter almond scent of arsenic on Catherine's meal tray. I described the pattern of poisoning, the specific meals that contained the poison, the progression of Catherine's symptoms. I described the sound of Caldwell's footsteps when he went to his wife's room, the deliberate, careful rhythm that indicated he was doing something that required precision and secrecy. I described the changes in his breathing and heart rate when Dr. Harrison asked questions about Catherine's illness, the subtle signs of deception that his body betrayed. I described the smell of nervous sweat on him when he discussed his wife's condition, the chemical signature of guilt and anxiety. I described everything I had perceived, every detail I had stored away in my memory, building a comprehensive picture of Josiah Caldwell's crime. The courtroom was absolutely silent as I testified. People were leaning forward in their seats, hanging on every word, completely absorbed in my account. When I finished, Pierce asked me one final question. "Esther, are you absolutely certain about what you perceived? Is there any doubt in your mind that Josiah Caldwell poisoned his wife?" "No, sir," I said firmly. "There is no doubt. I know what I smelled. I know what I heard. I know what happened. Josiah Caldwell murdered his wife slowly and deliberately over the course of 3 months. I witnessed it, and I am telling the truth." Pierce sat down, and William Harrison stood up to begin his cross-examination. I knew this would be the most difficult part of the trial. Harrison was a skilled lawyer, and his job was to destroy my credibility, to make the jury doubt my testimony, to paint me as a liar or a deluded fool. Harrison began his attack immediately. "Esther, you claim to have smelled arsenic on Mrs. Caldwell's meal trays, but arsenic is a poison that can be odorless in small doses. How can you be certain that what you smelled was actually arsenic and not something else?" "Arsenic does have an odor, sir," I replied calmly. "It smells like bitter almonds. Not everyone can detect it, but I can. I have a highly developed sense of smell, and I encountered that specific scent once before, years ago, when rat poison containing arsenic was used on a plantation where I worked. I would recognize that smell anywhere. But you're basing your entire testimony on a smell you encountered once years ago. How can you be certain your memory is accurate?" "I never forget a smell, sir. My memory for scents is perfect. It's one of the ways I compensate for my blindness. I can remember every scent I've ever encountered, and I can recognize them instantly when I encounter them again." Harrison changed tactics. "You claim to have heard Mr. Caldwell's footsteps and to have detected deception in his voice. But you're blind. How can you possibly know what you think you know? How can you be certain you're not misinterpreting what you heard?" "I have been listening to people's footsteps and voices my entire life, sir. It's how I understand the world. I can identify people by the sound of their walk, by the rhythm of their breathing, by the tone of their voice. I can detect emotions and deception by listening to the subtle changes in how people speak and move. These are skills I have developed over 30 years of being blind. I am not misinterpreting anything. I know what I heard." "But you admit you didn't actually see Mr. Caldwell put poison in his wife's food. You didn't see him administer the poison. You're asking this jury to convict a man of murder based on smells and sounds, not on actual visual evidence. How can that possibly be reliable?" "I didn't see it, sir, because I can't see anything. but I perceived it through my other senses, which are more acute and reliable than most people's vision. I smelled the poison, I heard the pattern of his behavior. I detected the deception in his voice. I witnessed the crime, just not with my eyes. And my testimony is just as valid as any sighted person's testimony would be. Harrison tried several more approaches, suggesting I had been coached by the prosecution, implying I was lying to gain my freedom, questioning my mental competence, attempting to confuse me with complex questions. But I remained calm and consistent, answering every question honestly and directly, never wavering in my testimony. After 2 hours of cross-examination, Harrison finally gave up, unable to shake my story or discredit my abilities. The trial continued for 3 more days with closing arguments from both sides. Pierce argued passionately that the evidence proved Caldwell's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, that my testimony was credible and reliable, that justice demanded a conviction. Harrison argued that the case was based on speculation and the unreliable testimony of a blind slave, that there was no direct evidence of murder, that Caldwell was an innocent man being persecuted by abolitionists who wanted to undermine Southern society. The jury deliberated for 2 full days. During that time, I waited in a small room in the courthouse, not knowing what the verdict would be, not knowing if my testimony had been believed or dismissed. Finally, on the afternoon of the 2nd day, the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom was packed once again, everyone waiting to hear the outcome of this historic trial. Judge Whitmore asked the foreman of the jury to announce the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Josiah Caldwell, guilty of murder in the 1st degree." The courtroom exploded. Some people cheered, others shouted in outrage, everyone talking at once. Caldwell's face went white, then red, then white again. He looked like a man who couldn't believe what was happening, couldn't accept that he had been brought down by a blind slave woman he had bought for 25 cents. Judge Whitmore sentenced Caldwell to death by hanging. The sentence was carried out on February 14, 1853, in the yard of the Charleston County Jail. I did not attend the execution. I had no desire to witness Caldwell's death, no need for that kind of closure. Justice had been served, and that was enough for me. But the story didn't end with Caldwell's execution. The trial had made me famous throughout the South and even in the North. Newspapers had covered every day of the trial, and my testimony had been reprinted in publications across the country. Abolitionists celebrated me as proof that enslaved people were intelligent, perceptive, and deserving of freedom and legal rights. Pro-slavery advocates denounced me as an aberration, a tool of abolitionist propaganda, a threat to the social order. And Judge Whitmore, deeply moved by what he had witnessed during the trial, did something extraordinary. He used his legal authority to grant me my freedom. I was manumitted, given papers that declared me a free woman, no longer property, no longer subject to anyone's will but my own. It was the first time in my 30 years of life that I had belonged to myself. Robert Thornton, grateful for the justice I had brought to his sister and impressed by my abilities, gave me a sum of money, $500, enough to live on for several years if I was careful. He also wrote letters of introduction for me, recommending me to contacts he had in Philadelphia, where there was a large and established free black community. I left Charleston in March of 1853, traveling north by ship to Philadelphia. It was the first time I had ever left the South, the first time I had ever been truly free to go where I wanted and do what I wanted. I settled in Philadelphia's free black community, in a neighborhood where formerly enslaved people and free-born black people lived and worked together, building lives and families and futures. I found work as a teacher, using my unique abilities to help blind children learn to navigate the world without sight. I taught them the skills I had developed, how to use their hearing to identify people and objects, how to use their sense of smell to gather information about their environment, how to use their sense of touch to see the world. I taught them that blindness was not a disability that made them less than others, but a difference that required them to develop other strengths. I married a free black man named James Washington, a carpenter who had been born free in Philadelphia. We had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, and I raised them in freedom, something I had never imagined would be possible when I was a slave. I lived a long life, dying in Philadelphia on November 12, 1891, at the age of 69. I was surrounded by my children and grandchildren, in a house that I owned, in a city where I was free. I was buried in Eden Cemetery, one of the oldest African-American cemeteries in the United States, and my gravestone reads, Esther Washington, 1822-1891. She saw everything in the darkness. I never forgot Charleston, never forgot the Caldwell House, never forgot the trial that changed my life and made history. I was the first blind person to testify as a key witness in a murder trial in the United States. I was the first enslaved person whose testimony led directly to the conviction and execution of a white man for murdering another white person. I was proof that disability does not mean inability, that blindness does not mean ignorance, that the senses we dismiss as secondary can be more powerful and reliable than the ones we take for granted. I saw everything in the darkness. I heard the lies, smelled the poison, felt the truth. And I used those perceptions to bring a murderer to justice and to prove that a blind slave woman worth 25 cents could change the world. They thought I was worthless, but I was priceless. They thought I couldn't see, but I saw everything. And in the end, I won. This was the story of Esther. She was freed by court order in Charleston, South Carolina, in February 1853, following her testimony in the murder trial of Josiah Caldwell. She moved to Philadelphia in March 1853 and lived there until her death on November 12, 1891, at age 69. She was buried in Eden Cemetery in Collingdale, Pennsylvania. Her testimony in the Caldwell case was cited in numerous legal precedents regarding the admissibility of testimony from disabled witnesses and enslaved people. The complete trial transcript is preserved in the South Carolina Historical Society archives. Catalog number SCHS 1853012. Esther's work teaching blind children in Philadelphia was documented in several contemporary accounts, including an 1870 article in the Christian Recorder titled, A Remarkable Teacher, the Blind Woman Who Sees All. Her descendants still live in the Philadelphia area. In 1995, the South Carolina Bar Association erected a historical marker in the Charleston County Courthouse commemorating Esther as a pioneer in disability rights and a testament to the power of human perception beyond sight. In 2018, the city of Philadelphia named a street in her honor, Esther Washington Way, in the neighborhood where she lived and taught. The echoes of Esther's extraordinary perception and courage reverberate through time, a powerful reminder that human beings possess remarkable abilities to adapt, overcome, and perceive truth in ways that transcend our expectations and challenge our assumptions. If this story of sensory brilliance, hard-won justice, and the triumph of truth over prejudice resonates with you, join our community. Subscribe to Slave Revenge to uncover more hidden stories of remarkable people who defied the limitations imposed on them and changed history through their courage and determination. Your support helps preserve these vital narratives and ensures that voices like Esther's are never forgotten. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. What would you have done in Esther's position? Would you have risked everything to speak the truth, knowing the dangers you faced?